Today we're going to look at designing cross-curricular art activities inspired by rich picture books. When I first started working as visual arts lead for my school district, I was looking for ways to connect teachers and students to artworks and to get them talking about art, to get them to respond to art. When looking at some museum pieces, we did some responding to art activities and it worked extremely well. But I realized that there was something that was even more accessible, that was right at our fingertips, and that was looking at the illustrations in rich picture books and using that as our spark and as our way to respond to art. It was also a great way to inspire art projects. So we were able to use the illustrations in picture books not only to respond to art, to talk about art, but to inspire us to create art. This book was one that I found that I loved working with. It's by Alexandra Penfold with illustrations by Suzanne Kaufman. And I've worked with it both in its French translation and English version. And the illustrations use some of our principles of design really beautifully. They use things like repetition and pattern and movement. And I really loved the way Suzanne Kaufman worked with color as well. I always try to make projects have certain limitations, but also allow for student choice and voice. The limitation in this case was the materials they had to work with: pattern paper, construction paper, yarn, buttons. And the challenge, the place that allowed them to really express their own voice, was to create a little self-portrait, a little version of themselves. What could be more personal than that? It was really wonderful to see how every student made their little character unique. And then came the challenge of creating the classroom for all these characters to live in. What are the most important parts of your room? What are the things you love? Some students wanted the smartboard. Some students wanted the vase of flowers that was always on their teacher's filing cabinet. And everyone found things in their classroom that they knew were important to include in their mural. The finished mural is a tour de force. It has the Canadian flag. It has their bookshelves. It has the windows. It has the beautiful colored balls that hang from the ceiling to make the room feel like a little party space. And it even has their teacher right there in the middle with her beautiful golden hair. And this is a book I like to use with kindergarten and grade 1 students. It's called Le Poisson et l'Oiseau. And it's a sort of Romeo and Juliet story about a fish and a bird who want to be best friends but discover they can't live in each other's world. It's really quite sweet. And I give the students the choice of making a bird or a fish, and we can create a little world where they can live together. We also look at the watercolor techniques that are used in this book, which are absolutely gorgeous, and learn how to create some of those effects in our paintings. You can see that the elements of art are still being used very strongly here. They start with line to create shapes, and then we work with color. And in the background, we play around with texture, looking at different ways we can create the look of water, and we can create the look of sky. How can we have our little birds and our little fish live together? My Winter City is a beautiful book by James Gladstone with illustrations by Gary Clement. And I teach a lot in rural schools, so this book gives us a nice chance for comparisons. We look at how winter in the city is different from winter in the country. And if we were going to create our version of this in a rural setting, what would we call it? My winter town, my winter village, my winter home. I like to use collage techniques, and I use them again in this particular project. A great thing about collage is that students think really well with a pair of scissors, and they create things that are truly unique. They start to think in terms of how to break things down into the details, like the windows and the roofs and the doors and all of the little features that are particular to their little house or their little building. This often leads to a collaborative part of the project where they work together to figure out how to make a background for all the things in their town. How are they going to create the look of the sky, the look of the snow? What kinds of things will they need to fill in the spaces? You'll see some students putting in some trees and some birds, and that is also a great way to have extra things for students to do who are those really quick workers, the ones who finish their little building in half the time of the other students. They can start to build the little forest. They can build the flock of birds. And all these things add a richness to the project. I try to make it so that they are all making their own version of a tree, their own version of a bird, and sometimes they have to do some problem solving to figure out how to do that. And then the finishing touches, putting in the bits of snow using a Q-tip and a little bit of white paint is a great way to finish it off. And sometimes we even use some cotton fluff on the roof of the house or coming out of the chimney. And they love those extra little bits. Part of creating this whole project does involve a certain amount of cooperation with all of those buildings, all of those trees, all of the birds, all of the other details. They have to work together to make sure there's room for everybody in the village, that there's room for everybody's house, and that everybody feels like they are part of the project. This book is another favorite of mine, My Heart is the Compass by Deborah Marcereau. It's a wonderful book about a little girl named Rose who creates these beautiful maps. And the children are enthralled by them. I've done quite a few different projects with this book, and it will vary depending on the amount of time I have with the students and depending on the age of the students. These students are creating their own maps of imaginary lands. They're looking at how maps are really special because they show 2 points of view at once. They show a bird's eye point of view of the roads and the rivers, and they show a view straight on of the buildings and the other details. We also get to talk about legends in maps, which is an intriguing thing. And they always like to include a legend in their map to show us what each symbol stands for, what route they are taking. Sometimes I give them a little extra challenge on this one and ask them to have a road that starts and finishes in the middle of each side of their page. Or it could be a river or a path. The nice thing about this is it becomes a collaborative project at the end. They can arrange their individual maps like a big jigsaw puzzle, connecting all their lands together, traveling from one land to the other. And if done right, they should be able to mix them up and go in a different order on a different route. Maps are a rich topic, and you can use it at any grade level. I certainly have done it with my high school students as well. But this is a grade 2 class working on how to create their town, how to reproduce the buildings in their town, how to create the river that runs along the edge of town, how to create a big background. And working together, they attach all the parts to the town. And you can see I'm using that same technique of encouraging them to make the extra items. Let's make the trees, let's make the birds. And that gives the students who need a little longer a chance to finish their building, and the students who are fast workers a chance to keep contributing in a way that's new and different and they feel is going to be important to the overall design. Here's their finished village. I love seeing the whole town spread out before us. And with older students, I've gone a little different direction and talked to them about symbolic buildings and how we can use a sort of an icon design for the building, like this student who's painting a giant pizza slice to represent the pizza store. And again, working together to create the background. Notice how the colors in this one, the background is green, but one of the things we talk about is how there's way more than one green in the landscape. So these students are using sponges, they're using green, they're using light green, they're using extra yellow, they're using extra blue. They're creating as many different shades of green as they can. And again, it requires a lot of cooperation to put things on the map together. And this group, a grade 5 class, had some extra challenges as well. They had to remember what order these landmarks were in their town. So they had to think back to the geography of the town. So in this case, these students are exploring some social studies ideas, whereas the previous groups, it was a little more of you and your world, kind of an early form of social studies, still looking at their town, but not in as detailed a way. And here's their finished map, and I love it. We live in Florenceville, the French fry capital of the world, the home of McCain food, and I noticed that the McCain plant is being represented by a giant container of French fries. I love that the hockey rink is a big hockey rink, and that the curling rink is a curling stone, the art gallery is a paint palette, and so on. These students had a lot of fun creating their map. This book by Kate Messner and Christopher Silas Neal is one in a series of books all about over and under the pond, over and under the waves, down in the garden and under the dirt, I think is one. So this one is over and under the snow. And I had a wonderful partnership with a science lead to design some art and science activities for this. Peter Chuziak, science lead for our district, came up with all kinds of wonderful science activities. But there was a wonderful crossover between the science and the art. He was looking at tracking animals and how animals create footprints and how to record what you find in journals. And I was looking at how students could recreate this idea of tracking animals and how we could create artwork based on that. The picture on the right are little stamps that were made by grade 4 and 5 students of actual animal tracks. So they were looking at pictures of animal tracks and trying to recreate them using fun foam stuck to a wooden block and little stamp pads to create the paths. This kind of project could be done on a grand scale with a big mural with all the animals crossing over each other and interacting, and each one creating a different path across the landscape. Well, on the left, those are bits of sponge or bits of pool noodle cut up because they create interesting shapes in themselves. And much younger students, kindergarten, grade 1 students, can create the path without having to create the actual footprint. So it's a nice way to differentiate between the two ages and the level of ability they have. We also looked at creating a whole landscape of over and under. This is a group of kindergarten students working on the trees that are over the snow and the animals that live over the snow. They work together to create all the things that live under the snow and put them together on this fabulous background. And you can see all of the layers. What I find really interesting about this is even at that level of kindergarten level, they are able to draw their own animals. They are able to create their own trees. They are able to make little habitats. And working individually at their seat gives them time to work that out. They get to practice their cutting skills by cutting out each thing that they've made and finding spaces for it in the big group mural. It's wonderful, wonderful layering of skills and ideas in their project. this was a grade 2 class creating little lift the flap pictures to show what's happening over and under the snow. Or creating little habitats of what's over and under the snow in 3 dimensions using little tea boxes and modeling clay. They still have to think in terms of space. What is above? What is below? How do we create that difference between the two? Perhaps one of the most fun projects I worked on was maybe the first one where I used a rich picture book, and I partnered with another science lead named Sally Hurst, and we developed an entire resource document based on this beautiful book, The Honeybee by Kirsten Hall, with illustrations by Isabel Arsenal. The book is a beautiful poetic story, but we were able to approach it from a lot of different points of view. So Sally was able to approach it through a science lens and looked at all the things that she could do to create science projects. I was able to approach it from an art lens, and we looked at how those things overlapped. Some of the things students did with this resource is create a honeybee garden. Each student in the class drawing a flower that was a great flower for pollinators, things that they could plant at home. So we had to do a little research about that. And also I was able to show them how a bee has a head and an abdomen and a thorax, and how many wings it had and where those wings were attached. And this is a grade 1 class able to take that in very well and create bees from a scientific point of view. We looked at how the bodies were made up of those parts first, and then I let them do it. I didn't try to walk them through step by step. I wanted to see what would they remember, what would be important to them. And it was quite a variety of things. It was quite wonderful. And again, another wonderful collaborative opportunity to piece these together, to look at our elements of art like color, to look at tone, and to see how can we make the best possible environment for our project. And each detail of these group paintings are just lovely. The flowers and the bees were done with oil pastel. The background is painted, so it gives them a couple of different materials to work with too. And here is a grade 1 class displaying their bee garden. And I love it. I love that the little girl on the right is wearing her sparkles and her shiny shoes and her tiara to class, and it gives me something to strive for, to be able to pull off an outfit like that. I think it's fabulous. This group used just watercolor paint pucks. You don't have to use liquid watercolors or liquid tempera paints or poster paints. The paint pucks are really great because they're not particularly messy and there's something easy for them to do. And again, they can still mix by rubbing their brush on the green, rubbing their brush on the yellow to see what kinds of mixes they can get in there. With some of the older students, we looked at how a hive was made up of these wonderful hexagons, and I made some hexagon templates for them to trace and then to fill the hexagons with things that they knew about bees. What were the bee facts? In their response, they're able to show me that they have been practicing the art skills. They are able to draw the bees, they are able to draw the hives, but they're also remembering the science content, the thing about the waggle dance, the thing about how the eggs are stored in the hive, the kinds of plants that are bee-friendly plants. And with an even older group, this was a grade 5 class, we tried some really unusual approaches, still including those scientific drawings. A bee has a head, a bee has a thorax, a bee has an abdomen, and looking at scientific drawings of bees and having them all create their own bees. But this particular group of students also went around their school and gathered up some dried plants and some other things. They went through their school and pulled papers out of the recycling bin. And we recycled that paper by making a paper pulp and by pressing it into molds. These are made from math manipulatives because you use what you have handy. We just tape them together to create our hexagons. And then they were able to embed their bee picture and some of the plant matter they found right into that. So they created these beautiful recycled paper hexagons. And here they are all drawing on a mat together. And here's a couple of the finished ones once they dried. They were absolutely beautiful, a really nice way to springboard from the picture book to a project that is both science-oriented, both in study of bees, but also in how paper is made, and art-oriented. I like to collaborate with other teachers, and once again, I was able to collaborate with Peter Trusiak and look at the book Snowbirds and look at all the things that we could do with snowbirds. We created a resource on a SharePoint site that has lots of science activities and lots of art activities. And I'm never beyond using the same project twice. So we looked at tracks of birds and went back to the stamping project. So that fit very nicely. But I also wanted to create something that was more specific to bird prints. So we were using odds and ends of leftover fun foam from other projects. So kind of recycling the scraps that were left over. We're using scraps of cardboard from cardboard boxes and cereal boxes and cutting out all the parts of the bird to stick on, which they used to ink. They rolled ink on and created prints from. We did some 3D work with this book as well, looking at creating habitats for the birds. The students who did this had to research their bird. Where do they live? Do they build their nests in trees? Do they build their nests on the ground? Do they build their nests in bushes? And they had to look at all the parts of the bird and how to create that using, in this case, plasticine, colored plasticine. There was an engineering challenge with this too because they had a folded piece of cardboard that had to be their background. And their challenge was, how do you make this stand up? And how can you attach things to it to create that sense of space? So talking about our elements of art, we looked at form, 3D structures, and we looked at space. How do we create this lovely space in 3 dimensions? With an older group, this was a grade 5 class, I had them each research a bird that is local to their area. So they are in central New Brunswick and they found ducks and blue jays and eagles and all kinds of birds that were local. We found pictures of the birds that they could look at and create a bird portrait. So these bird portraits are done in watercolor on watercolor paper, using our elements of line and of shape and working with color, another element, and looking at new techniques that were watercolor techniques, which I showed them as we went. And you can see they have quite a collection of birds. And we looked at other books that would also relate to it. A beautiful book called Nesting. There were several other books about birds that we had available for them to go through and to talk about how different birds are different sizes and different shapes. I also brought in some actual birds' nests to look at so they could see the kinds of habitats that they were building their worlds in. And as is often my way, they created a background that is a collaborative piece using spray bottles. I love using spray bottles with food coloring in them, spraying a blue sky. And then they each cut out some leaf shapes from styrofoam, which we inked and printed on the bottom part of this, creating a kind of a treetop world. And in their treetop, they placed their birds. And there was a great deal of conversation about how certain birds were going to be included in this because they really should be down lower on the ground. And they came up with some wonderful solutions. And this is their final mural design, which came together absolutely beautifully, and they are very, very proud. So there's lots of things to think about with the slides that I showed you, lots of different projects and different approaches I took. But there are some other things I'd like you to consider if you're working from picture books. It's important to honor the fact that it is a book and that you are also working on their literacy skills. And before starting a project based on a book, it's important to just read the entire story. Read it through, make sure that they have an understanding of it, make sure that the story itself is clear. It's amazing what multiple readings will do. You will go back and you'll read it again, and your students will point out things that they didn't notice the first time. To be honest, they'll point out things that you didn't notice, and I love it when that happens. And I know I repeat this a lot, but I also want you to always be thinking of the elements of art. Which element are you teaching? What are they learning about that element? Always make that part of the plan. In the New Brunswick Curriculum Guide, the outcomes for art, whether it's from kindergarten or grade 12, are divided into 3 strands: create, connect, and communicate. And it's a really great idea to always make sure you have something hitting each of those 3 strands in your activity. They are creating artwork in most of the activities that we talked about. They are making connections, sometimes to literacy, sometimes to science, sometimes to the environment, sometimes to their world around them, sometimes to social studies. And you need to give them time to communicate their ideas. They need to be able to ask questions, but they also need to be able to reflect back on their art, to tell you the story in the work that they've created, to ask each other questions, and to have some time to use that visual language that they have been learning. Lots to think about, and I hope you're able to come up with some ideas of how you would use your own rich picture books to create art activities that you will enjoy and that your students will enjoy. Thanks for listening.